The radio crackled with static over Kandahar airfield at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a blade through silk. Major Callista, Raven Thorne's voice came through the tower speakers, steady but strained. "Wolverine Base, this is Hog 77. I'm declaring an emergency. Aircraft is critically damaged. Engines failing. I'm not going to make it back." The tower fell silent. 3 seconds stretched into eternity as Captain Rodriguez gripped his headset, staring at the green radar blip that represented one of the Air Force's most experienced A-10 Thunderbolt II pilots. The blip flickered, wavered, then vanished completely from the screen. "Hog 77, say again your status," Rodriguez transmitted, his voice tight with controlled panic. Nothing but static answered him. He tried again, louder this time, as if volume could bridge the gap between life and death. "Hog 77, Wolverine Base, do you copy?" The silence stretched on, punctuated only by the distant rumble of generators and the soft hum of electronics. Around the tower, night shift personnel exchanged worried glances. Major Thorne wasn't just any pilot. She was the squadron's most decorated A-10 driver, with over 200 combat missions and a reputation for bringing home aircraft that should have been classified as scrap metal. If Raven couldn't coax her Warthog home, the situation was dire indeed. Colonel Marcus Webb, the 354th Fighter Squadron commander, materialized at Rodriguez's shoulder like a ghost, his weathered face etched with concern. Webb had flown combat missions himself, had lost good people to the unforgiving mathematics of warfare. He knew that look in Rodriguez's eyes, the helpless frustration of watching a dot disappear from a screen, knowing it represented someone's daughter, someone's future. "Time of last contact," Webb asked quietly. 0347, sir. She was approximately 40 clicks northwest, returning from a close air support mission in the Korangal Valley. Webb nodded grimly. The Korangal was a meat grinder, a place where helicopters went to die and fixed-wing aircraft limped home trailing smoke and prayers. The terrain was unforgiving, jagged peaks that could tear an aircraft apart, narrow valleys that funneled anti-aircraft fire with deadly precision. If Major Thorne had gone down out there, search and rescue faced a nightmare scenario. "Contact SAR immediately," Webb ordered. "Get birds in the air. I want every available asset sweeping that area." He paused, studying the empty radar screen. "And Rodriguez, keep trying to raise her. Sometimes these old warthogs surprise you." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the tower. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, nicknamed the Warthog, was legendary for its ability to absorb punishment and keep flying. Built around the massive GAU-8 Avenger cannon, it was essentially a flying tank designed to loiter over battlefields and provide close air support to ground troops. The aircraft could lose engines, control surfaces, even landing gear and still make it home. But the laws of physics were absolute, and even warthogs had their limits. As the first search and rescue helicopters spun up their rotors in the distance, painting the tarmac with rotor wash and determination, nobody in that tower could have predicted what would unfold in the next 18 hours. Major Callista Thorne had earned her call sign, Raven, not for the color of her hair, which was actually a practical auburn pulled back in regulation, but for her uncanny ability to appear where the enemy least expected her, delivering death from above with the precision of a hunting bird. At 34, she was one of the youngest majors in the Air Force, a distinction that had earned her both respect and resentment in equal measure. Her colleagues would later admit they'd underestimated her from the beginning. Standing barely 5'4" with a slight frame that looked lost in her flight suit, Thorne didn't fit the Hollywood image of a fighter pilot. She didn't swagger through the squadron-ready room trading war stories and testosterone-fueled bravado. Instead, she studied her maps with quiet intensity, memorizing every ridge and valley, every landmark that might mean the difference between life and death. The truth was, Major Thorne had grown up in the mountains of Montana, where her father had taught her to hunt elk in terrain that would challenge a mountain goat. She understood the relationship between predator and prey, the patience required to wait for the perfect shot, the absolute necessity of knowing your escape route before you committed to the kill. These skills translated perfectly to the cockpit of an A-10, where survival often depended on split-second decisions made, while flying barely above the tree line at 300 knots. Her first combat deployment had been Iraq in 2008, fresh out of flight training and eager to prove herself. The older pilots had watched her with barely concealed skepticism, making jokes about Barbie in a flight suit, and wondering aloud whether she'd freeze up when the bullets started flying. Those jokes died quickly during her third mission, when she'd saved a pinned-down Marine unit by threading her A-10 through a canyon system that looked impossible on the map and suicidal in person. The Marines on the ground that day didn't care that their salvation came from a woman who looked like she should be teaching elementary school. They only cared that the distinctive sound of the GAU-8 cannon, a thunderous BRRRRRRT that could be heard for miles, had scattered the insurgents who'd been trying to kill them for 6 hours. When Major Thorne pulled off target that day, her aircraft riddled with small arms fire but still flying, she'd earned something more valuable than respect. She'd earned trust. Now, 5 years and 4 deployments later, that trust was being put to the ultimate test somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, where the darkness held secrets that would challenge everything her squadron thought they knew about courage, skill, and the thin line between impossible and inevitable. The search and rescue operation began before sunrise with the methodical precision of a military organization that had perfected the art of finding the unfindable. 2 HH-60 Pave Hawks lifted off from Kandahar, their crews scanning the rugged landscape below with night vision goggles and forward-looking infrared sensors. The terrain was a searcher's nightmare. Endless ridges and valleys carved by millennia of wind and weather, creating a maze where aircraft wreckage could hide for decades. Captain Jamie "Ghost" Morrison piloted the lead Starbird, her crew chief and pararescue specialists scanning the mountainous terrain through their respective sensors. Morrison had flown search missions before, had pulled pilots from wrecked aircraft and crash sites that defied belief, but something about this one felt different. Major Thorne wasn't just another pilot. She was the squadron's unofficial guardian angel, the pilot other aircrew called when the mission looked impossible and the stakes were life and death. Wolverine Base, this is Rescue 11, Morrison transmitted over the command frequency. We're approaching the last known position, beginning search pattern Alpha. The radio response came from Colonel Webb himself, who'd assumed personal control of the operation. Copy, Rescue 11. Weather is deteriorating rapidly. You have approximately 3 hours before the storm front closes the window. Morrison acknowledged with a double click of her microphone, but privately she wondered if 3 hours would be enough. The mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, a geological labyrinth where an A-10, even a damaged one, could disappear completely. The weather wasn't helping either. Clouds were building along the ridges, threatening to reduce visibility to mere yards and making flight operations exponentially more dangerous. 2 hours into the search, with fuel gauges dropping toward the point of no return, Morrison's crew chief spotted something that made his heart race. A glint of metal in a narrow valley, barely visible through the morning haze. As they descended for a closer look, the distinctive twin-tail configuration of an A-10 resolved through the clouds, apparently intact but sitting at an impossible angle on what looked like a narrow mountain shelf. Wolverine Base, Rescue 11 has possible visual contact with the missing aircraft, Morrison reported, unable to keep the excitement from her voice. Aircraft appears to be in one piece, but the landing site looks challenging. What she didn't say, what she couldn't say over an open radio channel, was that the landing site looked impossible. The A-10 sat on a rocky outcrop barely wider than the aircraft's wingspan, surrounded by cliffs that dropped away into darkness. No runway, no cleared area, no visible way in or out. It looked less like a landing and more like a miracle of physics and pilot skill. But there was something else, something that made Morrison's trained eye narrow with concentration. The aircraft's position wasn't random. It was precisely aligned with the narrow valley's axis, suggesting a controlled approach rather than a crash landing. Someone had deliberately put that warthog exactly where it sat, threading a needle that most pilots wouldn't attempt in broad daylight with unlimited fuel and perfect weather conditions. The search and rescue helicopter circled the impossible landing site like a metal vulture, its crew struggling to comprehend what they were seeing. The A-10 Thunderbolt II sat motionless on a rocky ledge that couldn't have been more than 50 feet wide, surrounded by granite walls that rose vertically on three sides. The aircraft's landing gear had been retracted, suggesting a belly landing, but the fuselage appeared intact with no visible fire damage. Master Sergeant Tony Wrench Kowalski, the crew chief, focused his binoculars on the cockpit. "Sir, I can't see any movement in the aircraft. Canopy appears to be intact, but there's no sign of the pilot." Captain Morrison felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. In her experience, motionless aircraft usually meant one of two things. Either the pilot was injured and unable to signal, or the pilot was beyond help. Either way, they needed to get someone down there, and the terrain made that proposition nearly impossible. Wolverine Base, Rescue 11 requests permission to attempt personnel recovery, Morrison transmitted. "We'll need to fast rope a PJ down to the aircraft." The pause before Colonel Webb's response stretched long enough for Morrison to picture him studying maps and weather reports, calculating risks and options. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of command decisions that could haunt a man for decades. "Negative, Rescue 11. Weather window is closing rapidly, and that terrain is unsurvivable if you lose an aircraft. Return to base and we'll reassess when conditions improve." Morrison gritted her teeth. Every instinct screamed at her to ignore the order, to drop Staff Sergeant Pete Guardian Chen onto that ledge and extract Major Thorne regardless of risk. But discipline won out over emotion, as it had to in military operations where individual heroics could doom entire crews. "Roger, Wolverine Base, Rescue 11 returning to base." As her helicopter climbed away from the impossible landing site, Morrison caught one last glimpse of the A-10 through her side window. Something about the aircraft's position nagged at her, too perfect, too precise for a desperate emergency landing. It looked almost like Major Thorne had been aiming for that specific spot, as if she'd known exactly where she was going. The flight back to Kandahar passed in frustrated silence, broken only by the rhythm of rotor blades and the distant rumble of approaching storm clouds. Back at Kandahar Airfield, the squadron-ready room had transformed into an impromptu command center, with maps spread across every available surface and a crowd of pilots huddled around the radios. The news of Rescue 11's sighting had spread through the squadron like wildfire, generating a mixture of relief and apprehension that Major Thorne had been found, but couldn't be immediately rescued. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Hammer Davidson, the squadron's deputy commander, stood before a detailed topographical map of the search area, using a red pen to mark the location where Morrison had spotted the A-10. The landing site, if it could be called that, defied every principle of aeronautical common sense. "Ladies and gentlemen," Davidson announced to the assembled pilots, "we have a unique situation. Major Thorne appears to have successfully landed her aircraft on terrain that our flight manuals would classify as impossible. Weather has scrubbed further SAR operations for at least 12 hours, which means we wait." Captain Rick Viper Torres, one of the squadron's more outspoken pilots, raised his hand. "Ma'am, with respect, how do we know Raven's even alive? That ledge looked barely wide enough for a bicycle, let alone a warthog." Davidson's expression hardened slightly. She'd served with Callista Thorne for 3 years and had seen her accomplish things that redefined the word impossible. "Because, Captain, we're talking about a pilot who once landed an A-10 with no hydraulics, one engine, and half a wing missing. Until we have evidence to the contrary, We assume Major Thorne is alive and planning her next move." The room fell silent as the implication sank in. If Major Thorne was indeed alive on that mountain ledge, she was trapped with limited supplies, deteriorating weather, and no immediate prospect of rescue. The A-10's survival equipment included emergency rations, medical supplies, and communication gear, but even those wouldn't last indefinitely in the harsh Afghan mountains. First Lieutenant Maria Phoenix Castellanos, the youngest pilot in the squadron, studied the topographical map with intense concentration. Something about the landing site's location sparked a memory from her geography classes at the Air Force Academy, something about mountain flying and emergency procedures. "Ma'am," she said hesitantly, "I think I know why Major Thorne chose that specific landing spot." All eyes turned to the young lieutenant, who suddenly found herself the center of attention from pilots with decades more experience. Colonel Webb materialized in the doorway, his weathered face drawn with fatigue and worry. He'd been coordinating with higher command, trying to arrange additional SAR assets and weather reconnaissance flights. The storm front moving across the region promised to ground all aircraft for at least the next 18 hours, turning a rescue operation into an endurance test. "What's your theory, Lieutenant?" Webb asked, crossing to stand beside the map. Castellanos pointed to the marked location, then traced her finger along the surrounding ridges. "Sir, this location isn't random. It's positioned at the confluence of 3 valleys, with approaches from multiple directions. In mountain flying training, we learned that experienced pilots sometimes use natural terrain features as emergency landing strips. Major Thorne didn't just crash land here. She chose this spot." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. If Lieutenant Castellanos was correct, Major Thorne hadn't been a victim of mechanical failure and desperate circumstance. She'd been a pilot executing a calculated decision under impossible conditions, threading her damaged aircraft through mountain passes to reach a predetermined emergency site. Webb studied the map with new eyes, seeing patterns that had been invisible moments before. The landing site commanded views of 3 separate valley approaches, provided natural protection from prevailing winds, and offered concealment from ground-based threats. It was, he realized, exactly the kind of position a tactically minded pilot would choose if forced to put an aircraft down in hostile territory. The storm struck Kandahar airfield at 1400 hours with the fury of nature unleashed, turning the sky dark as midnight and grounding every aircraft on the base. Hurricane-force winds howled across the tarmac, driving sand and debris horizontally, while thunder crashed overhead like artillery bombardments. In the squadron-ready room, pilots watched through rain-streaked windows as their world disappeared behind walls of water and wind. Colonel Webb paced the length of the room like a caged predator, his frustration evident in every step. Weather reports predicted the storm would continue for at least 18 hours, possibly longer. In the mountains where Major Thorne waited, conditions would be exponentially worse. Sub-freezing temperatures, driving snow, and winds that could literally blow a person off a cliff. "Sir," Captain Rodriguez's voice cut through the sound of rain hammering the windows, "I'm picking up intermittent radio transmissions on the emergency frequency." Every conversation in the room stopped. Webb crossed to the radio console in 3 quick strides, grabbing the headset and pressing it to his ear. Through the static and interference caused by the storm, he could barely make out a faint signal, Morse code, transmitted in short bursts. Captain Jennifer Codes Park, the squadron's communications specialist, appeared at Webb's shoulder with a notepad and pencil. She'd learned Morse code the old-fashioned way during survival training and could decode messages that electronic systems missed entirely. Dash dot dash dash, dot dot dot, dash dash dash, Park murmured, scribbling letters as the transmission continued. After 30 seconds, she looked up with amazement in her eyes. "Sir, it's Major Thorne. Message reads, Raven alive, aircraft damaged but repairable, investigating hostile activity in Sector 7. Will attempt contact at 600 tomorrow. Tell Ghost her landing zone is viable for emergency extraction. The ready room erupted in controlled chaos as pilots gathered around the radio console, everyone talking at once. Major Thorne wasn't just alive. She was conducting reconnaissance operations while stranded on a mountain ledge in the middle of a blizzard. Lieutenant Castellanos felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside. "Sir, did she say hostile activity in Sector 7? Webb nodded grimly. Sector 7 was a designated area of operations where intelligence reports had suggested increased Taliban movement, but no concrete evidence had been gathered. If Major Thorne was observing enemy activity from her elevated position, she'd stumbled onto something significant, something that could change the tactical situation in the entire region. "Codes, can you reply to that transmission?" Webb asked. Park shook her head. "Negative, sir. These portable emergency radios are receive-only for Morse transmissions. She can send to us, but we can't acknowledge receipt." The implications were sobering. Major Thorne was alone on a mountain, surrounded by hostile territory, with no way of knowing whether her messages were being received. She was operating on faith and training, trusting that someone below was listening and would respond when the weather cleared. Captain Morrison, who'd been monitoring weather reports on her tablet, looked up with cautious optimism. "Sir, there's a possible break in the weather pattern around 500 tomorrow. If Major Thorne can hold position until then, we might have a narrow window for extraction." Webb studied the weather projections, his experienced eye reading the implications in the swirling patterns of clouds and pressure systems. The window would be brief, perhaps 2 hours of marginal flying, weather before the next storm cell moved through the area. "All right, people, here's how this works," he announced to the room. "We plan for a dawn extraction, weather permitting. Morrison, I want your Starbird configured and ready to launch at first light. Viper, you'll lead a 2-ship escort to provide overwatch. And I want every available aircraft on standby in case this turns into something bigger than a simple personnel recovery." As the pilots dispersed to begin mission planning, Webb remained at the radio console, hopping for another transmission from the mountain. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the airfield, but inside the ready room, the mood had shifted from despair to determined action. Major Callista, Raven Thorne, was alive, and her squadron was going to bring her home. The storm passed at 4:45 hours like an exhausted giant finally surrendering to dawn, leaving behind crystalline air and a landscape transformed by fresh snow. Colonel Webb stood on the flight line watching his aircraft crews perform pre-flight inspections by the pale light of sunrise, their breath forming clouds in the frigid morning air. Captain Morrison's HH-60 Pave Hawk sat ready for launch, its rotors slowly turning as systems came online. Beside it, 2 A-10s configured for escort duty underwent their own preparations, pilots running through abbreviated checklists with the efficiency of professionals who understood that time was their enemy. At precisely 600 hours, the emergency radio crackled to life with another Morse transmission. Captain Park, who'd spent the night catnapping beside the radio console, snapped instantly awake and began transcribing the incoming message. "Message reads," she announced to the assembled personnel, "Raven to base. Large enemy convoy assembling in valley adjacent to my position. Estimate 40 vehicles, mixed transport and technical. Convoy appears to be staging for major operation. Request immediate air support and ground reconnaissance. My position remains secure, but aircraft unable to engage without repairs." Webb felt his blood turn to ice. A 40-vehicle convoy represented a significant military force, potentially hundreds of Taliban fighters preparing for a major offensive. The intelligence value of Major Thorne's observation was immense, but it also meant she was sitting in the middle of a hornet's nest with no way to defend herself if discovered. "Change of mission parameters," Webb announced. This is now a combat operation with rescue as secondary objective. Morrison, you still have extraction duty, but Viper and his wingman are now tasked with immediate strikes on that convoy. I'm launching additional aircraft to provide area denial and close air support. Lieutenant Colonel Davidson approached with an updated weather report and tactical assessment. Sir, we have approximately 90 minutes of marginal flying weather before the next storm cell arrives. If we're going to do this, it has to be fast and clean. Webb nodded, understanding the implications. A combat operation in deteriorating weather over mountainous terrain, with limited time on target and precious cargo to extract. The margins for error had shrunk to nothing, demanding perfect execution from every crew member involved. Captain Torres finished his pre-flight inspection and jogged toward the operations building, his flight suit already soaked with sweat despite the freezing temperature. Sir, Viper flight is ready for launch. We'll establish contact with Major Thorne and prosecute targets of opportunity while Morrison attempts extraction. As the first aircraft lifted off from Kandahar, climbing into the pale morning sky like metal angels of warfare, Webb remained on the ground coordinating the complex dance of combat operations and personnel recovery. Somewhere in the mountains ahead, Major Thorne waited in her damaged A-10, serving as both forward observer and rescued pilot in a mission that would test every limit of skill and courage. The radio fell silent except for the routine chatter of aircraft checking in with air traffic control and reporting their progress toward the target area. In 20 minutes, Webb's carefully orchestrated plan would either succeed brilliantly or fail catastrophically, with Major Thorne's life hanging in the balance. The flight toward Major Thorne's position took the rescue formation through some of the most challenging terrain in Afghanistan, where knife-edge ridges and narrow valleys created wind patterns that could flip an aircraft upside down without warning. Captain Morrison flew her HH-60 with the calculated aggression of a pilot who understood that smooth was fast and fast was survival, while Captain Torres and his wingman maintained high cover in their A-10s. Wolverine Base, this is Viper 1-1, Torres transmitted as they approached the target area. We have visual contact with suspected enemy convoy. Confirm weapons free for immediate engagement. Colonel Webb's response came instantly. Viper flight, weapons free. Prosecute all targets of opportunity. Priority is destruction of convoy before they can disperse. Through his targeting pod, Torres could see the enemy vehicles spread across a narrow valley like toys arranged on a tabletop. 40 vehicles, just as Major Thorne had reported, with personnel moving between them in patterns that suggested preparation for departure. Whatever operation the Taliban had planned, it was about to begin. Rescue 1-1, this is Viper 1-1, Torres called to Morrison. We have multiple targets in sight. Recommend you hold position until we've cleared the immediate area. Morrison acknowledged while maintaining a hover behind a concealing ridgeline, her crew scanning for threats and planning their approach to Major Thorne's impossible landing site. Staff Sergeant Chen, her para-rescue specialist, reviewed his equipment one final time, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether they returned home with a rescued pilot or additional casualties. The first GAU-8 cannon run shattered the morning silence like the world's largest chainsaw, Torres A-10 diving toward the convoy with the unstoppable momentum of gravity and firepower combined. The distinctive BRRRRRT of the 7-barrel cannon echoed off the mountain walls as armor-piercing depleted uranium rounds found their targets with surgical precision. Enemy vehicles erupted in flames and debris as the 30 rounds tore through metal and flesh with equal efficiency. Torres pulled off target and immediately began setting up for his second attack run while his wingman, Captain Lisa, Shark, Nguyen, rolled in from a different angle to catch the convoy's attempted dispersal. From her perch on the mountain ledge, Major Thorne watched the attack unfold below her position with professional appreciation and growing concern. The convoy had been larger than her initial estimate, closer to 50 vehicles, and the Taliban fighters were responding with surprising discipline, manning anti-aircraft weapons and attempting to establish defensive positions. Through her aircraft's damaged but functional radio, she transmitted another Morse message. Raven to Viper flight. Be advised, enemy has Zu-23 anti-aircraft guns in position. 3 confirmed positions on Eastern Ridge. Recommend approach from Western Valley. The warning came just as Captain Nguyen began her attack run, diving toward the convoy from exactly the direction Major Thorne had identified as dangerous. Torres saw the muzzle flashes of the Zu-23 guns opening fire, twin streams of 23 rounds climbing toward his wingman's aircraft like deadly fireworks in reverse. Shark break left, AAA AAA. Torres shouted into his radio, watching helplessly as the anti-aircraft fire reached toward Nguyen's A-10. The next 10 seconds would determine whether the rescue mission became a catastrophe, with multiple aircraft down in hostile territory and crews scattered across unforgiving mountain terrain. In her damaged Warthog, Major Thorne watched the battle unfold and began calculating her next move, knowing that her squadron's survival might depend on decisions she made in the next few minutes. Captain Nguyen's A-10 shuddered as 23 rounds punched through her starboard wing, but the Warthog's legendary durability kept her airborne despite damage that would have downed most aircraft. She pulled hard left, climbing away from the anti-aircraft fire while reporting her status over the radio. Viper 1-2 is hit but still mission capable, Nguyen transmitted, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. I've got holes in my wing and some hydraulic issues, but the bird's still flying. From her mountain perch, Major Thorne watched the tactical situation develop with growing urgency. The Taliban convoy was beginning to disperse, vehicles scattering toward multiple valley exits in patterns that suggested pre-planned escape routes. More concerning, she could see additional anti-aircraft positions being unveiled on surrounding ridges, positions that hadn't been visible during her initial reconnaissance. Using her damaged aircraft systems, she composed another urgent Morse transmission. Raven to all flights. Enemy has prepared layered air defense. Count 6 Zu-23 positions plus numerous small arms. Convoy splitting into 3 elements. Recommend immediate area denial to prevent escape. Captain Torres processed the information while setting up for another attack run, his tactical computer calculating angles and approach vectors that would minimize exposure to ground fire. The mission was rapidly evolving from a simple convoy interdiction into a complex air-ground engagement against a prepared enemy force. Wolverine Base, this is Viper 1-1, Torres transmitted. Target is larger and more heavily defended than initial intelligence suggested, requesting immediate reinforcement and extended time on target. Colonel Webb's response carried the weight of a commander making life-or-death decisions based on incomplete information. Copy, Viper 1-1. Reinforcements are inbound, but weather window is closing rapidly. You have 30 minutes maximum before all aircraft must return to base. Captain Morrison, monitoring the tactical frequency from her concealed position, felt the mission parameters shifting beneath her like sand in an hourglass. The longer the air battle continued, the more dangerous her extraction attempt became. Enemy forces throughout the region would be converging on the sound of gunfire, and her lightly armed rescue helicopter would be vulnerable to ground fire from any direction. Rescue 1-1 to Wolverine Base, Morrison transmitted, requesting permission to attempt immediate extraction while Viper flight has enemy attention focused elsewhere. Staff Sergeant Chen, her para-rescue specialist, was already rigging his fast-rope gear and checking his medical kit. The flight across hostile terrain to reach Major Thorne's landing site would be dangerous enough. Attempting it while enemy forces were actively engaged nearby elevated the risk to nearly suicidal levels. Through the static-filled radio, Colonel Webb's voice carried a mixture of authority and concern. "Morrison, the decision is yours. You're the aircraft commander on scene. But remember, we can't afford to lose any more people today." The helicopter lifted from its concealment and began threading through the mountain valleys toward Major Thorne's position, its crew knowing that the next few minutes would test every skill they'd learned and every prayer they'd ever offered. Behind them, the air battle intensified as additional A-10s arrived on station and began systematically destroying the Taliban convoy with the methodical precision of aerial predators. In her damaged Warthog, Major Thorne prepared for extraction while continuing to provide tactical intelligence to the attacking aircraft. She'd survived the night through skill and determination, but the real test was just beginning. Captain Morrison's helicopter approached Major Thorne's landing site through a maze of granite walls and wind currents that seemed designed to destroy aircraft. The rocky ledge, where the A-10 sat, looked even more impossible from close range. A narrow shelf barely wide enough for the Warthog's wingspan, with vertical drops on three sides that disappeared into morning shadows. "Jesus," muttered Sergeant Kowalski, the crew chief, as he studied the landing site through his crew door. "How the hell did she get that thing down there?" Staff Sergeant Chen was already moving toward the door, his fast-rope gear secured and medical pack strapped to his back. The plan was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. Hover the helicopter as close as possible to the ledge while Chen rappelled down to assess Major Thorne's condition and determine if she could be extracted. "Raven, this is Rescue 11, Morrison transmitted on the emergency frequency. "We're approaching your position. Can you confirm your status and extraction capability?" Major Thorne's voice came back immediately, clear and professional despite her circumstances. "Rescue 11, Raven is mobile and ready for extraction. Be advised, I need to transfer critical intelligence data before departure. This information is time-sensitive and mission-critical." Morrison felt her heart rate increase. The tactical radio chatter from the air battle below indicated the enemy convoy was still partially operational despite ongoing attacks. Whatever intelligence Major Thorne had gathered during her night-long vigil was important enough to risk additional exposure time in hostile territory. The helicopter settled into a precarious hover 30 feet above the rocky ledge, its rotor wash creating miniature tornadoes that sent loose stones cascading into the abyss below. Chen clipped onto his fast rope and prepared to descend, but as he looked down at the narrow ledge, he realized the margin for error was literally measured in inches. "Ma'am, this is tight," Chen reported to Morrison over the intercom. "One wrong step and I'm buying the farm." Below them, Major Thorne emerged from her damaged A-10, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd spent hours calculating every step on terrain that offered no forgiveness for mistakes. She carried a small data storage device and what appeared to be a detailed map covered in handwritten annotations. Chen began his descent on the fast rope, fighting wind currents that threatened to slam him against the granite walls or carry him over the edge into empty space. 20 feet down, 15, 10, and then his boots touched the rocky ledge with a solid thump that represented successful completion of one of the most dangerous rappelling operations any of them had ever attempted. "Rescue 11, Guardian is on the ground," Chen reported, "making contact with the survivor now." Major Thorne moved toward him with steady steps, her flight suit torn and dirty, but her bearing still unmistakably that of a professional military officer. In her hand, the data device seemed to pulse with importance, intelligence that could change the course of operations throughout the region. "Sergeant, we need to move fast," Thorne said as Chen approached. "That convoy below isn't the main force. It's a decoy. The real attack is being staged 15 kilometers north, and it launches in less than 2 hours." Chen felt his blood turn cold as the implications sank in. While the A-10s were destroying vehicles in the valley below, the primary enemy force was preparing to strike at targets unknown, using the air battle as a distraction to mask their true intentions. The rescue had suddenly become a race against time, with the lives of unknown friendly forces hanging in the balance. Staff Sergeant Chen took the data device from Major Thorne with hands that barely trembled despite the 30-foot drop surrounding them on three sides. The intelligence she'd gathered during her mountain vigil could be the difference between a successful enemy attack and a catastrophic defeat for coalition forces. "Ma'am, we need to get you out of here immediately," Chen said, gesturing toward the hovering helicopter above them. "Can you handle extraction by hoist?" Major Thorne looked up at Captain Morrison's HH-60, calculating angles and wind patterns with the same analytical precision she'd used to land her damaged A-10 on an impossible ledge. The rescue hoist would require her to trust her life to a steel cable and the skill of pilots she'd never flown with before. "Sergeant, I've trusted my life to worse odds," she replied with a grim smile. "Let's get this done." Chen activated his radio and spoke directly to Morrison. "Rescue 11, Guardian has the package and critical intelligence. Survivor is ready for hoist extraction. We need to move fast. Intelligence indicates imminent threat to friendly forces." Morrison's response came immediately. "Copy, Guardian. Deploying hoist now. Be advised, we're picking up increased radio chatter from enemy positions. They may be vectoring forces toward our location." The rescue hoist descended from the helicopter like a steel lifeline, fighting wind currents and rotor wash as Morrison struggled to maintain precise position over the narrow ledge. One miscalculation could slam the helicopter into the granite walls or send both Chen and Major Thorne tumbling into the abyss. Major Thorne secured herself in the rescue harness with movements made efficient by countless hours of survival training. As the hoist began lifting her toward the helicopter, she looked down at the rocky ledge where her A-10 sat like a wounded bird, its battle damage clearly visible in the morning light. "Guardian, what about the aircraft?"